Today's daf is daf ayin beis, but we're going to begin where we left off yesterday. We still have the last third of the Amud on daf ayin aleph Amud beis. And you'll see about 15 lines up before the end of the Amud, Amalei, Markshisha, Breder of Chizdol, Rav Ashi, and the subject of this Gemara is Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi is of the opinion that a guy, an idolater, cannot acquire ownership through Mashiach. Toshma, we have a proof that Mashiach, in fact, is effective with regard to idol worshippers from our Mishnah. Hamocher yeno li oved kol chavim. And the question now is, when a Jew sells the wine to the oved kol chavim, if it becomes yayin nesach before the idol worshiper acquires ownership over the yayin, then the wine is now osir b'hana, therefore the Yisrael cannot sell the wine. And the Mishnah makes the following distinction: Pasak ad shelo modad dam of mutarim. If they set a price before the idol worshiper actually measured out the wine, then in such a case, the akum was kona the wine, and therefore later on, when he measures out the wine and the wine becomes yayin nesach, that's in the rishus of the akum. The Yisrael did not sell yayin nesach, so therefore everything is mutter, and the monies that are received as payment from the guy to the Jew is mutter for the Jew to enjoy the benefit of that monies. According to you, Rav Ashi, if Mashiach is not an effective kinyan for an akum, amai dam of mutarim. If we're going to assume that the guy did not yet make a kinyan because his Mashiach is not valid, then the yayin became yayin nesach when it was still in the rishus of the Yisrael. How could it be mutter? And the Gemara answers, the actim le dinar. The idol worshiper paid up front in advance a dinar, and apparently the idol worship was now kona not through Mashiach but through the Kinyan Kesef. So the Gemara says, wait a second. If you take a look at that same Mishnah, our Mishnah, you see a reish and a seifa, hochi emos seifa. The seifa says that if modad ad shelo pasak, dam of asurim. In other words, if before the price was set, the idol worshiper already made a medida, and therefore he touched the wine, and the wine now becomes yayin nesach in the rishus of the Yisrael, and therefore the domim is also either kadam le dinar. But if we're talking about a case where the idol worshiper paid up front a dinar, then he was kona beforehand a dinar, and then it became yayin nesach after his kinyan in the rishus of the akum, amai dom of asurim. So basically, what the Gemara is asking Rav Ashi is that how can you differentiate between the ratio where it says dvar dam of mutarim and the sefer with damim asurim, if you're talking about a case of pasak of the actim le dinar, then in both cases it should be mutter. Amalei uladidach, and let's assume that you hold that Mashiach is a valid kinyan. So how are you going to learn this Mishnah? Tiamrit, you hold Mashiach b'avgel Amai reisha dam mutar v'seifa dam asurim. What's going to be the difference here between the reisha and the seifa? Why is it in the seifa where he performed and implemented a mashicha when he measured the wine? Then you should say that now the idolater was kona the wine, and it was still permitted, and therefore it's permitted. So why not say the same thing in the reisha? How do you justify the difference between the reisha and the seifa? I'm sorry, I said Reisha, but I meant to say Seifa, right? And the Seifa it says that Dom of Asurim, and the Gemara answers Pasak Samcha Daite, Lo Pasak, Lo Samcha Daite. So in other words, even if you hold that Mashicha is a valid Kinyan, I can still justify the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa, because in the Reisha, there was Psikas Domov. Now, once there's Psikas Domov, then there's what's called Kamiras Das, or Smichas Das. In other words, you're not entering into a sale without any knowledge of how much it's going to cost you, because you already set the price. Once you set the price, then there's going to be Smichas Das. And then the Kinyan Mashicha could be meaningful. But in the case of the Seifa, and there was no psikas domim, so they didn't set a price, then therefore, even if the idol worshiper who bought the wine, even if he made a kinyan mashicha, he was not kona because he didn't have smichas das. He didn't know what kind of price the Jew is going to charge him. Is therefore once the you is the phantom uh, uh, bar plukta of Ravashi who holds that mashicha is a valid kinyan. Is Lididi Nami, says Ravashi, I who hold that Mashiach is not a valid kinyan for a goy, I can also use that same logic to explain the difference between the Reish of the Mishnah and the Seif of the Mishnah. And Afal Gav de Kodim Le Dinar, even though, as Ravashi had already said, the entire Mishnah is talking about a case where the money was paid, the dinner was paid to the Jew up front, I can still justify the difference between the Reish and the Sefer. Why? Because, okay, the price was set, but did the guy have smichas das? Well, it depends. In the Reisha of Pasak, there was already a set price that was agreed upon. Somcha daite, the guy has resolved to buy it, and therefore the kinyan is chal. And the kinyan here, according to Ravashi, is not a kinyan meshicha, but rather a kinyan kesef. But in the Sefer Lo Pasak, they did not set a price beforehand. Is therefore lo somcha daite, and even though there was money that was changed hands, and the guy paid money as part of this purchase, but nevertheless he didn't have Kabir Das, and therefore the purchase is not valid, and therefore it became Yayin Nesech when the guy measured it out before the kinyan that the guy has, and therefore it's still Jewish wine, and now the Jew owns the Yayin Esach. If the Jew owns the Yayin Esach, he can't have any anah from it, and the money that he's paid to by the guy later on cannot be his. He can't use that money. Amalei Ravina, the Gemara now has another proof that Mashiach is Kona. Tashma, we learned that Omar Rab Chia Bar Abba Omar Rabbi Yochanan Ben Noach Nerag al Pachs B'Shav Prut. So a guy steals less than a Shav Pruta from a Yisrael, and he's chayiv misa for that. Because when it comes to Gzela, in the case of an akum, then it doesn't matter whether it's a Shav Pruta or not a Shav Pruta. And then Rabbi Yochanan adds, V'lo nitan lihishavan, that the violation now of stealing from a Jew less than Shav Pruta is Mechayev Misa. And although normally, let's say, there would be Mechila on Pachos Mishav Pruta, but here in the case of an Akum, there's no Mechila, because the Akum attaches significance to even less than a Shav Pruta. Nevertheless, says Rabbi Yochanan, the Akum is not liable to return the object that he stole, even though the Torah says Ve'eshav Sagzela Shar Gazal, because the Jewish owner was Misyayish. And the reason for that is because it's less than a Shava Prut. Back to Gemara, V'i Amr, according to you, Rav Ashi, that Mashiach B'Yovikuchav Menakona. So it means that the guy who stole Pachos Mishava Pruta, and therefore you want to say that he had a kinyan gzela through Mashiach, but you are telling me, Rav Ashi, that Mashiach is not valid for an akum, is Amai Nerag. Why should it be put to death when he didn't make a kinyan on the gzela? And the Gemara seems to assume that you're not chayiv for gzela unless you make a kinyan gzela. And the Gemara gives a very strange answer, which I tried to understand. I didn't really comprehend it fully, but it says Mishum Ditzari Yisrael. So it's not because the guy is chayiv and dini mominos for stealing a pachs b'shuv for the Jew because the guy made a kinyan. No, according to Rav Ashi, the guy could not have made a kinyan with Mashiach. Mashiach is not valid. But the reason why the idol worship is put to death is because he caused suffering for the Jewish victim by taking away his article. And this is considered like an act of stealing because of the distress that was caused to Israel. And now we start today's daf, Ayin Beis, which is a very nice Rashi Tevis, Ayin Beis, I like it. So the Gemara says, following my lo nita li shavon, what does Rabbi Yochanan mean that there's no possibility of returning it? I mean, if he didn't make a kinyan on it, because we're holding now, according to Rav Ashi, that Mashiach is not coded for a guy, so it really belongs to the Israel. I mean, the guy never made a kinyan on it, and therefore, what does it mean that he doesn't return it? What do you mean return it? It's not his. And where it says the Eda b'Toras, he's shavah, meaning that the object is not subject to the law of returning. In other words, what you said before, that the entire obligation of returning a stolen object has no application here because the article was never technically removed from the possession of the Israel. That's exactly what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he said Lonita Lishava. It's Eina B'Toras Ishav because the guy didn't make a kinyan on it because Mashiach is not coded. The Gemara says Ema Seifa. Rabbi Yochanan continued and he said, if a second guy steals it from the first guy, the second guy is chayiv. Oh, Bishlei Maresh, I understand why the first Ganav is chayiv mishum ditzari Yisrael. Fine. But the second Ganav stole it from John Paul Jones, who stole it from the Israel. There's no inyan of mitzare anymore. He's not causing any problem. And if you're going to tell me that the first guy never made a kinyan on it because Mashiach is not kona for nakum, so why is the second one who steals it from the first one chayev? Ela seifa my ovid, ela shmami no Mashiach b'yovikachav kona, and this is the final line, the bottom line, the conclusion of the Gemara that enach hinami against Rav Ashi. We've proven conclusively that a guy could be kona with Mashiach, and therefore when the guy steals the object that's less than a Shabbat, he made a kinyan on it, and that's why he's chayiv misa, because he violates gzela shmamim. Ahu gavet yomelei lechavre im misavdinan lei lahayara lechav. If I ever decide to sell this piece of real estate, I'm going to sell it to you. Oh, so he went ahead and zavdol in shakrina. He sold it to somebody else. Is that a valid kinyan? On Rabbi Yosef, kana kama. The first one is kona. Why? Because the original stipulation of the mocher was that he would sell it to the first guy. Now, the sale to the second guy is not valid, but we do determine through that sale exactly how much the object is worth and at what price the seller is willing to pay it. So now the first guy will pay exactly that price that the second guy was assumed to pay, and he's kona Amalei Abaye v'holo pasa. 1 second. At the time of T1, when the mocher said to this guy, you know what, if I ever sell this karka, I'll sell it to you, there was no price that was set. So how was the first guy able to be kona? And says Abaye, you'll ask me, how do I know that unless there was a set price, there's no smichas das, as we said before, there's no valid kinyan. This nan hamocher yeno the obligation posach ad shalom moda the mutar posach So we see that a kinyan that was implemented before they set the price is not valid. It's not effective. And that's basically a repetition of what we had on Omid Aleph. I'm sorry, on Ayin Aleph Omid Beis, namely that the guy could only acquire a kinyan if there was psikas damim, because otherwise he doesn't know how much the money of the sale is going to be, and therefore he doesn't have smichas das. And my Havila, how do we decide the final halacha? The Gemara says, I don't get it. What do you mean, my Havila? You're asking a silly question. Kidduka Amrina. And we just proved from our Mishnah that if a kinyan was performed before the price was set, it's not a valid kinyan. So the Gemara says, Dilma, if not for the statement that we finally conclude that the halacha is that without psikas domim the kinyan is not valid, Dilma Chumra, the Yayin Nesach shiny. Maybe this whole din is not a din in dini momenos, but rather it's a din in Isa Veheta with regard to the Yayin Nesach. And Yayin Nesach has the chumrah of Avoda Zara, and we're always machmir in Avoda Zara. And therefore, with regard to the chumrah of Yayin Nesach, there the Rabbanim made a psak lechumrah that we don't accept a kinyan that was performed unless it's a set price. And if we don't accept a kinyan, then when the guy touches the wine, he's touching Jewish wine, and therefore will be machmir on the din of Yayin Nesach. Toshma. We're going back to again prove Abayi's point that unless there's psikas domim, there's no smichas das, and the kinyan is not effective. The Omer of Uvda Havi Beirav Chizda, right, in the base Medrash of Chizda, Beirav Chizda Beirav Huna. Rav Chizda went over to the base Medrash of Rav Huna to consult with him. Upashte mihadisanya, they came to a conclusion. Again, we're talking about a case where the kinyan was performed before there was a set price agreed upon, and we're going to prove it from this price. Mashach Amarav Upolov. So there's a lot of produce that's sitting on the donkeys, and the drivers are carrying all this produce, and the buyer, the lokeach, comes along and he pulls the donkey drivers and any workers who are working on the produce, and he brought him into his house. And now the question is whether or not the guy has acquired the produce. And to our surprise, the Brisa says that bein posek achlo modad, bein modad achlo posek lo kona, ushneim yicholim lachzer b'hem. That it doesn't matter whether or not there was a price agreed upon before the actual measuring of the produce, or there was a measuring of the produce before they were posek domim, lo kona. Right? There's no acquisition. And that would support Abayi's position that a kinyan performed before the price is set is ineffective. Since the kinyan is not effective, then both the buyer and the seller have a right to withdraw from the sale. But Pirkon, if let's say they took the produce from these donkey drivers or laborers and they unloaded them, so they brought into the house not the donkey drivers and the laborers, but they brought into the house the produce itself, and the produce is now sitting on the floor of the bride's house. Is posek achlo modad ein shneim yichom lachzebo. If there was already a decision, an agreement on the set price, then the kinyan is chal even without measuring the produce. And that means that neither the buyer or the seller could withdraw from the kinyan. But madad achlo posak, if the produce was measured out, they hadn't set a price, The buyer therefore has no clue what exactly he's going to have to pay. Shneim yichon lachzabo. The kinyan is not chal. So you see that a kinyan is not effective, and we're not talking about nesach yain nesach here, but simply the price wasn't set. Who gavra the Omer Chav? So one person said to his friend, "Is avinilach lahai aramas bedinilach b'mea zuzi." If I ever decide to sell this field, I'm going to sell it to you for 100 zuz. Azal zavna leish nachrin. He went ahead and he sold it to a second person b'mea v'yesrim at 120 zuz. Omer Rav Kahana kana rishon kana kama. Now, at what price is he kona? One second, let me just see if he says anything here. So again, I'm just going to take a stab at it. I don't see it explicitly here. Maybe you have it in your Gemara, but I think it means it's sold to the first one at the price that they set, which was Me'ezuz. Maskif lorav is Yaakov Minar Kod. Hi, Zuze Ansua. There was no smichas das in this case. The reason why he sold it to the second guy, because he was desperate for funds, and the second guy was willing to pay 120 zuz. So again, the only reason he sold is because Zuze Anse, right? He was making a profit from the second buyer. So what is Rav Yaakov saying over here? That in this case, the fact that the seller sold the field to the second buyer, that does not indicate whatsoever that he was ready to leave his farm, his sada, and give up the field. It was the extra cash that he was offered, which drove him to sell. Accordingly, the conditions of the first sale agreement have not yet been met, and the first buyer does not acquire the field. He says here that even if the first buyer were to approach the seller with 120 zuz offer, the seller would still be under no obligation to sell it. So the bottom line of this sugya, if we just summarize it, is that the first buyer has no claim because the only reason why the seller sold it at the end of the day was because he needed the money or he was very tempted to enter into a sale with that extra profit of 20 zuz, so that the original psikas domim to the first fellow was not does not really indicate that he sold it to the first guy. He only sold it to the second guy because of the extra money. Okay, now we go on to more of the details regarding two parties to a sale. Amalei, instead of telling him what the price would be, Kiddush B'Tlosa, we're going to go for an appraisal to three people. And afilu tremigo tlosa, and if two out of those three people agree to a certain price, that's what the price will be. Kina amri b'tlosa. If, on the other hand, the seller said it would be sold at the price that was said or established by three, then adi amri b'tlosa. then the price is not considered set until all three agree on the same price. Kidishamoy bi'arba. If the seller said it will be appraised by 4, adi amri bi'arba. V'cholshkein heicha di'omalei kida amri bi'arba. And certainly, all the 4 people, right, that formed this kind of evaluation committee would have to agree to the price. Heicha di'omalei, where the seller said to the buyer, Kida Amri, as was said by 4. Omalei Kidashami v'tlasa, getting back to the case where the seller said to the buyer, as it will be appraised by 3. Fi asu tlasa v'shamua, 3 came along and they appraised the value. Fi omalei idach, and now the buyer says to the seller, Leisu tlasa achrina de kimlu tfei. I'm not happy with this appraisal of these 3. I want to get another 3 people. They're more experts in appraising it. Let them appraise it. It means that the buyer has the right to block the deal and say that I never agreed to these 3 evaluators. I demand that the matter be resolved by more experts. Maskefle Rav Huna Mimai de Hani Kimlut Fei. Who says that the second group of 3 are more experts than the first group? Dilmahani Kimlut Fei. Maybe the first group are more experts in evaluating the price. The Hilchasak Rav Huna Hureid Rav Yeshua, that this kasha that's raised, this objection by Rav Huna, is accepted la halacha, which would mean that the seller has a right to say to the buyer, who told you that the second group that you want to appoint as the committee of evaluation is any more expertise than the first group? And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Ayin Beis. Okay, so this Mishnah is going to deal with the issue of connections between wine coming from top to the bottom. So the Jew is now selling his wine to a guy. Not alasa mashpech. Mashpech is a funnel. Umarad letoch tzluchiso shel ove kochavim. So the Jew is now measuring out wine into the flask of an idol worship of a chazar umarad letoch tzluchiso shel Yisrael. Now he takes that very same funnel, that mishpach, and he measures wine into a Jewish flask. Do we assume that since he used that funnel for the first measuring of wine, then there might be yayin nesach there that now is going to get mixed up with the second funneling from that same funnel? Im yesh bo akeves yayin also. Meaning, if there's, remember we spoke about the lip around the top of the utensil. So if there's a protruding lip, then it retains a drop of the wine that was poured in the previous case. Also, so let's say the flask of the guy, now the Jew puts the funnel into the flask, and some of the wine goes, through the funnel into this protruding lip, and it's retained there, and that yayin is yayin nesach. And now, when he uses the same funnel for a Jew to measure it out through that funnel, there's a mixture of a drop of yayin nesach. Therefore, it's also hama'ara mikli al kli. However, if he pours from one kli into another kli, eshe era mimenu mutar, the wine that remained in the first flask is mutar, but she'ira litocho also, the wine that is in the vessel into which he poured the wine is prohibited. So the Jew is pouring wine from his vessel into the vessel of an idolater, and the Gemara later on is going to explain that the Mishnah is referring to an idol worshiper who poured kosher wine from a Jewish vessel into another vessel of the Jew. The wine in the lower vessel is prohibited because it was propelled by the idol worshiper's force. That's going to be the sugi of kocho. The wine in the upper vessel remains permitted because the prohibition that was instituted by the Chazal of wine propelled by an idol worship's force to wine did not extend to that which was not propelled out of the vessel by force. Tanan Hossam, now the Gemara quotes a mission in Taros, so I'm going to make a comparison and a contrast between Taros and Yayin Nesech. Hanitzok v'katafris u'mashke tofeach eino chibolo l'tuvo l'tar. So what's nitzok? Nitzok is an unbroken stream that goes from the top to the bottom. Katafris is basically enough liquid to moisten something. So now we're talking about katafris is a flat area which is damp to the degree that it moistens something that touches it. But it's not so damp that the moisture could then be transferred from that thing to a third object. So it only goes up to the second object. So that's called mashke tofer. So what's katafris? So the difference between katafris and nitzok is that nitzok is vertical, a stream that goes from on top to the bottom. And katafris, I believe, is on the ground. Right? There's running, a flow of running, or maybe down a slope. And this is not considered a chibur, a connection between two liquids for passing on tuma. Lo litara. But what does that mean, lo litara? If a mikveh contains less than 40 sa, it's connected to a mikveh containing 40 sa through a vertical flow or an inclined flow or a damp surface. Those were the three categories that we had. They are not considered halachically joined into a large mikveh. So with regard to Tumah, we have a kula over here. But with regard to Tara, we have a chumrah. Omar of Huna, Nisov katafris umashke tofer chibul in yayin nesech. So if you have this stream that goes vertically from up to down, or flowing water down a slope, or liquid sufficient to moisten, that is a connection with regard to nesech yayin. So if one pours kosher wine from a vessel into a vessel containing nesach wine, you got nitzok. And even the wine in the upper vessel is prohibited. Now, as far as the other two connectors are concerned, Rav Huna is saying that a vertical stream, a flow over an incline, and a damp surface all connect kosher wine to yayin nesach, which renders the kosher wine prohibited. Amalei Rav Nachman l'Rav Huna minolan ha. How do you know this halacha of chibur with regard to yayin nesach? If it's based on the Mishnah that we just learned, hanitzava katafris umashke tofeach eno chibur lo l'tum v'lo l'tara. L'tum l'tara hu de lo chibur, lo avi chibur. Ha'alin yayin nesach avi chibur. Why did the Mishnah limit itself to tum v'tara? Why didn't the Mishnah add yayin nesach? The answer is that in yayin nesach, these things do create a chibur. What are you going to do with the Mishnah in the Seifa? It says Hashboren chibur l'tuma l'tara. If we have liquid that's settled already, that creates a connection for the purpose of contracting to, which is a chumrah or the kula of producing tara in the case of a mikvah. So now let's be medayik the way we medayik before. So you see that if you take a diuk from the reisha of the Mishnah, you come to one conclusion, namely that we should be machmir and yayin nesach. But if you want to be medayik from the Sefer, then we're going to come to the opposite conclusion that linyanai nesach lo avichibur, and we could make el alav mehol lekel mashmin. From this Mishnah, we have no proof because we don't know whether to be medayik from the ratio or from the Sefer. Tanan, but our Mishnah says no. Tell us a mashpech. Umadad l'soch sluchisu shalovi kochavim. V'chazu umadad l'toch sluchisu shel Yisrael. And the Mishnah is going to make a whole big to-do as to whether or not there's a lip in the bottom of the funnel that could retain the yayin, and that's considered also.